In this third and final lesson on muscular tissue, we will wrap up the topic by looking at the sources of ATP that power contraction and relaxation. We'll also consider the concepts of muscle fatigue, oxygen depth, types of muscle fibers, and of course, how aging and exercise affect muscular tissue. So where does this ATP come from that is required to not only power the myosin heads during that energizing hydrolysis phase, but also required for detachment as well as sequestering of calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Muscles need a lot of ATP. All right. ATP inside the muscle fibers, or preformed ATP, can only power contraction for a few seconds. We need other sources of ATP following this. After the preformed ATP is used up, ATP is then formed from creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate is a molecule inside muscle cells that stores energy in a phosphate bond. That energy in the phosphate can quickly be transferred to ADP to make new molecules of ATP, and that will power contraction for about 15 seconds. Enough for Usain Bolt to win the 100-meter dash at the Olympics. All right, but what if he's doing the 200 or 400? He's going to need more ATP. That ATP comes from anaerobic cellular respiration or glycolysis. And the ATP produced by glycolysis can power contractions for about 2 minutes. But now let's talk about a long distance runner. They're going to need more ATP beyond that required for 2 minutes of physical activity. So that ATP comes from your classic aerobic cellular respiration, where pyruvate enters the mitochondria, forms acetyl coenzyme A, goes through Krebs cycle, and then the reduced coenzymes are used in the electron transport chain to produce copious amounts of ATP that can power contraction for minutes to hours. So in order, ATP that's already inside the muscle cells can power contraction for a few seconds. Then ATP is produced from creatine phosphate and ADP, which provides ATP for about 15 seconds of activity. Following that, ATP is formed by anaerobic cellular respiration or glycolysis in the cytoplasm of the cell that can power contraction for about 2 minutes, and anything beyond that requires ATP production by aerobic cellular respiration inside mitochondria. So here we have creatine phosphate. Whenever the cell is resting and there's excess ATP, the energy is transferred to creatine phosphate. And then creatine phosphate can transfer that high energy phosphate group to ADP to quickly regenerate new ATP during activity. So again, creatine phosphate and ATP can provide enough energy for contraction for about 15 seconds, which is shown here on the left. Okay, the transfer of that high energy phosphate group from creatine phosphate to ADP to form ATP, or when ATP is in excess, the high energy phosphate group can be transferred to creatine to form creatine phosphate as a storage form of the energy. On the right of the diagram, we have anaerobic cellular respiration that produces small amounts of ATP that can power contraction for about 2 minutes through glycolysis. You should be familiar with those steps. Note that muscle glycogen provides some of the glucose required for glycolysis. And if physical activity is prolonged, then on the bottom left, we have the events that lead to cellular respiration in the mitochondria that lead to large amounts of ATP being formed. So muscle cells can use glycogen as a source of glucose for the substrates of aerobic cellular respiration, But muscle cells can use fatty acids as well. Those are converted into acetylcoenzyme A that enter Krebs cycle. Pyruvic acid from glycolysis can also be metabolized into substrates that enter the mitochondria, as well as amino acids from protein breakdown. So we saw that amino acids can be used to make new glucose for cells that can only take up and use glucose, but in muscle cells, amino acids can actually be used as substrates for aerobic cellular respiration. So you may have experienced muscle fatigue. That is when you actually feel tired in your muscles. And it is the inability of muscle to maintain the force of contraction after prolonged activity. So no matter how much training an endurance runner engages in, eventually they got to stop running. Even Forrest Gump had to stop running after a while. All right. If you're holding on for dear life to a rope, to a cliff, one cannot hold on indefinitely. Eventually, the muscles become too fatigued to prolong activity. The mechanisms of muscle fatigue are not clearly understood, but several factors are believed to contribute to this fatigue. Now, before the muscles actually quit and can no longer contract, mentally, we begin to perceive fatigue. And that's where mental strength will allow some individuals to prolong their activity more than others. But eventually, physiological fatigue sets in. So here are the factors that contribute to this inability to maintain contraction force. Eventually, calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum cannot be maintained. We also have depletion of our energy reserves in the form of creatine phosphate, or the cells cannot make sufficient amounts of ATP under aerobic conditions because the oxygen is not adequate. There's also depletion of the substrates for cellular respiration, so depletion of glycogen stores and other nutrients. The buildup of lactic acid and other metabolites, including ADP, are believed to contribute to fatigue. And eventually, there may be failure of the motor neurons to release enough acetylcholine to maintain stimulation of contractions. All right, during prolonged periods of muscle contraction or physical activity, your body will attempt to acquire more oxygen to promote ATP production by increasing breathing rate and depth, as well as blood flow to the muscles, and this will provide oxygen for ATP production. But have you ever wondered why you continue to breathe heavily for a period of time after stopping exercise? It is due to something called oxygen debt, and this refers to the added oxygen over and above your resting oxygen consumption that is taken into the body after exercise. It is believed that this extra oxygen is used to pay back your muscle cells for all their exertion. Okay, it's pay back oxygen debt. So this oxygen is used to make or to power the reactions that replenish the creatine phosphate stores in your muscle cells. It is also used to convert any lactic acid that was produced under anaerobic conditions back into pyruvate, which can then be used to form glycogen and replenish the glycogen stores in your muscle tissue. Note that the glycogen stores are also replenished by glycogenesis from dietary glucose. It is also used to reload oxygen onto myoglobin proteins within the muscle cells so that oxygen can be stored and be made available for future contractions. All right, we're finishing up. Let's look at muscle tone. Even when you're not physically active, your muscles are contracting, and that is called muscle tone. It's a small amount of tension in the muscles due to weak contractions signaled by motor units. So recall that a motor unit is a single somatic motor neuron and all the skeletal fibers it signals. So even at rest, small groups of motor units are alternatively active and inactive, or contracting and relaxing consistently to sustain muscle tone. This keeps muscles firm. Remember, if muscles are not stimulated or if they're not used, they will atrophy. If they are not used, they will break down. Muscle tone is responsible also for balance. For example, it keeps your head from slumping forward on your chest. There are different types of muscle contractions. Muscles don't always shorten when they contract. Let's look at them. In isotonic contractions, the tension developed in the muscle remains constant while the muscle changes its length. Isotonic contractions occur when the body parts are being moved or when we are using our muscles to move objects. For example, when one picks a book up off the table, they are flexing at the elbow. The bicep brachii muscle, which is the muscle of flexion, is shortening and it's pulling the forearm towards the shoulder. If a muscle shortens while it contracts, that is called a concentric isotonic contraction. However, while the bicep brachii is contracting and shortening, the muscle on the opposite side of the joint, the tricep brachii, is actually contracting but lengthening as it tries to oppose the flexion action. That is necessary to smooth out the action of flexion so that as you try to flex, you don't snap yourself in the head. The tricep resists the activity of the biceps, and as it contracts, it is actually lengthening. That is called an eccentric contraction. So if it's changing length, it's isotonic. If the change in length is shortening, that is concentric. If the change in length is lengthening, that is eccentric. Now, you may have also experienced isometric contractions. This is when the tension generated is not enough for the object to be moved, and the muscle does not change its length, even though it may be increasing in force or tension. So this occurs when one tries to hold a book steady using an outstretched arm. Okay? You're resisting gravity. You'll actually feel muscle fatigue after a while, even though your arms are stationary, the book is not moving, but your muscles are contracting in order to maintain the book in that position. Also think about trying to push against an object that is heavier than you, or trying to push a wall. You can push, push, push. You'll feel tension in your arms, in your shoulders, in your back, even in your thigh muscles as you dig into the ground and try to push that object. If the resistance is greater than the force you can generate, the muscle length will not change even though the tension may be increasing. So these types of contractions are depicted in these images. In panel A, we have a concentric contraction while the book is being raised. In B, they try to show you an eccentric contraction for that same muscle. So in this case, while the book is being lowered, that is caused by the activity of the tricep brachii. It is extending at the elbow, but the bicep brachii is also contracting, trying to resist the lowering action so that the book doesn't fall too quickly. But while the bicep brachii is contracting, it is also lengthening. So in that case, the bicep brachii is experiencing the eccentric contraction. And then holding an object steady, your muscle length is not changing, but the muscles are contracting. That is called an isometric contraction. Within a given skeletal muscle, there are different types of skeletal muscle fibers, and they can vary in their content of myoglobin, which leads to the classification of red muscle fibers versus white muscle fibers. Red muscle fibers have a high myoglobin content, they bind more oxygen, and therefore appear darker or redder. Okay? This accounts for the dark meat in the chicken legs and thighs if you eat chicken. They also contain more mitochondria, and are supplied by more blood capillaries, which also contributes to their red appearance. So these type of fibers are abundant in muscles that perform long endurance type activities, such as in the legs and thighs, where the muscles are responsible for maintaining posture, as well as walking and running. White muscle fibers have a low content of myoglobin and therefore appear lighter and contribute to the white meat in chicken breasts. These tissues with a high abundance of white muscle fibers are located in areas of the body where short bursts of intense energy are required, such as the breasts in chickens, which is used to power their wings for flying, or in humans, in the shoulders and arms for things like throwing, catching, or manipulation. Okay, so white muscle fibers are better adapted for short bursts of energy, low or short duration, while red muscle fibers are located or abundant in areas of more long-term endurance type activities. We mentioned earlier that skeletal muscle tissue is highly differentiated and has limited capacity to undergo cell division. Essentially, you're born with all of your muscle cells that you're going to have for life. And after birth, growth of muscle tissue is mainly due to hypertrophy, which is an increase in the size of the individual fibers. So skeletal muscle fibers grow with the proliferation of precursor cells called satellite cells that slowly divide and fuse with existing fibers. So the existing fibers cannot divide to make new muscle fibers. However, they can grow by fusing with these less mature satellite cells. Satellite cells also proliferate and fuse with pre-existing muscle fibers for repair of damaged fibers. Now, for those of you that are interested in bodybuilding or putting on muscle bulk, when you stress the muscles, you actually are creating tiny tears or tiny areas of damage to the muscle fibers. Those are repaired by the fusion of satellite cells in those pre-existing fibers, and this is what causes muscles to grow. Now, cardiac muscle is also considered highly differentiated and can undergo hypertrophy for growth, especially in response to an increased workload. Now, this can be healthy in those that undergo cardiac training. So many athletes have enlarged hearts, but that hypertrophy occurs slowly over time, and as the tissue is growing, the blood supply to the heart tissue is also increasing so that there is a balance. However, cardiac hypertrophy in a disease state, for example, due to hypertension or atherosclerosis, involves growth of the heart tissue that outpaces its blood supply, and that can lead to heart ischemia, which manifests as heart pain called angina. As usual, we finish our chapters by looking at how aging affects the tissues of the system we are considering. So with respect to muscle tissue, as you enter those middle-age years, between 30 and 50 years of age, about 10% of your muscle tissue is actually replaced by non-contractile fibrous connective tissue and adipose tissue. You see it. As people age, their muscle tone decreases, they get a little more rubbery flubbery, and they decrease in muscle strength and endurance. As they age further, so between 50 and 80 years of age, another 40% of muscle tissue is replaced. My goodness. What are the consequences of this? Muscle strength and flexibility decrease as we age. The reflexes, the muscle responses to certain stimuli, also become slower, and you can think of all the implications of this. Decreased flexibility and strength can lead to increased risk of injury, Slower reflexes as well can lead to further injury, tripping, falling, not being able to get out of the way of injury, etc. Also, the number of slow oxidative fibers increase. And these are the fibers that are involved in endurance and posture. But again, with a decrease in the fast glycolytic fibers, the reflexes become slower. All right, so how do you reduce these effects? Just like the skeletal system, continued muscle activity, physical activity, walking, running, swimming, biking, any type of physical activity will promote muscle building and repair and will reduce the replacement and also keep the muscles and joints flexible and your reflexes sharp. All right, hope you enjoyed that chapter. I did.